Hello, my name is Yang Wang. I'm a reference librarian at Greenwich Library. Welcome to Date with an Author. Our date tonight is Ron Lieber, author of The Price You Pay for College, an entirely new roadmap for the biggest financial decision your family will ever make, published by HarperCollins on January 26, 2021. Signed copies are available for purchase at Diane's bookstore. Ron Lieber is the author of The Opposite of Spoiled and is the Your Money columnist for New York Times. Two of his books have been New York Times bestseller. He's a three-time winner of the Gerald Lears Award, business journalism's highest honor. Mr. Lieber will be interviewed by Kristen Jacks. Kristen is a financial educator and the founder of The Money in Your 20s. She started her career at Kiplinger's Personal Finance magazine and later worked at the Mutual Fund magazine. Now, let me turn the screen to Kristen and Ron.
Thank you, Young, and thank you, Ron, for joining us, and thank you, Greenwich Library, for hosting this very important Date with an Author. Hi, Ron. Congratulations on your new book, and thank you for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Kristen, and thanks to the library. This is it, The Price You Pay for College, out on January 26th, available wherever books are sold, including the signed copies at your local independent bookseller.
Fantastic. Let's get started. Ron, there's a great quote in your best-selling book, The Opposite of Spoiled. It reads, "Figuring out how much to pay for a college education is one of the biggest financial decisions people make in their lifetime, and parents often leave the final call to a 17-year-old who has never purchased anything more expensive than a bicycle." Was it this observation that motivated you to write The Price You Pay for College?
Yes, you caught me. Essentially, I was spooked. When I was working on that last book, when I was working on The Opposite of Spoiled, I knew that it had to end somewhere, right, at a certain age. And what I realized very early on in the reporting process was that the college decision and all of the money around it was looming so large in people's minds that there was no way that I was going to be able to wrestle it to the ground in The Opposite of Spoiled. And so I just made a determination that that book was going to have to stop essentially at age 16 or 17 as far as the parents were concerned. But every move I made in the reporting almost inevitably led me to some question, whether it was an aside or whether it was a central question in a story that I was reading about college and how to pay for it, and most importantly, what to pay for it. So I kept throwing those questions and those articles into a different file, and it just became increasingly clear over time that that was adding up to something much bigger than I was going to be able to tackle in my personal finance column in the New York Times.
Absolutely, like 300 pages bigger. The subtitle of your new book is An Entirely New Roadmap for the Biggest Financial Decision Your Family Will Ever Make. Your revelations about merit aid definitely created a new roadmap for me. I have a daughter who's a junior in high school, and prior to reading your book, the family motto was great or state. Either you get into one of the top 50 highly selective colleges, or you go to state school because it doesn't make sense to pay $70,000 a year for something outside the top 50. Your book is a game changer because it introduces a totally different idea, which is merit aid. In merit aid, you could go to a good private college and pay half the advertised rate, even if you don't qualify for financial aid. What's going on here? What is merit aid?
Yeah, so we're opening a pretty big can of worms here, but let's start here, right? The reason why a new roadmap was necessary was that financial aid doesn't look anything like it looked when you and I were going to college. And here's what's changed. The need-based system, where you get money, although maybe not as much as you need, but based on your family's financial circumstances, that still exists in the world, but there is a whole separate category of financial aid that mostly did not exist 25 or 30 years ago. It's come to be known as merit aid, and it works in a variety of different ways. But the most important thing to recognize is that it has nothing to do with financial need. It's about the institution's priorities. Sometimes the institution's priority is to buy away straight A students with 1600 SAT scores, to buy them away from the Ivy League and get them to their institution to try and raise the profile of the institution. Sometimes the point of merit aid is to keep really high quality students in state at a public university instead of losing them to someplace else. And sometimes merit aid is just a competitive response to some other school that's throwing merit aid around. And it's become so competitive that at less selective private colleges, basically everybody gets a trophy. Everybody gets merit aid. And for parents who don't understand what's going on behind the scenes, it can become a kind of psychological trick where you feel like you're being patted on the head as a student or as a parent for having raised a particularly meritorious child, where the school is actually giving you a below average discount and you could probably ask for more. And again, these discounts have nothing to do with what you need. It's all about a disconnect between the ability to pay and the willingness to pay, which is what you sum up so interestingly in the great or state dichotomy that you've created in your own household, which I hope that I've now effectively made more complicated.
Well, it's worth pointing out that you're not talking about insignificant discounts. You're talking about $20,000 off the sticker price, $30,000 off the sticker price. I think at one point in your book, you said the average was maybe 52% off the sticker price. Is that right, or do I have that wrong?
Yeah, so it depends whether you're talking about tuition or whether the overall cost of attendance. But here's a way to think about it if you're looking at private colleges. With public universities, it works a little differently, although the discounts can be of similar size. But if you think about a private college, which can basically do whatever it wants and doesn't have a constituency of in-state students and in-state politicians that it needs to deal with, right? So think about a private college that is sort of slugging it out in the marketplace and has a list price of $75,000 all in. An increasing number of parents who may have the ability to write a check or to save $75,000 per year are questioning whether that school is great enough to merit full price. And so what these schools have realized is that they need to offer some kind of discount so that people are willing to pay whatever it is that they are able to charge in the marketplace. So imagine a school with a list price of $75,000 and it starts discounting for some, but not all families who have the ability to pay, say $20,000 a year. So now all of a sudden the price is $55,000. That school is still coming out ahead if its cost to educate each undergraduate is only $45,000. So right then it's making a $10,000 profit, so to speak, which it can then use to cross-subsidize other students who in fact lack the ability to pay. And that's how the game is often played at many private colleges and universities.
And since we're calling it a game, let's look at what the game might mean. Obviously, someone should apply to a good college looking for merit aid. Like that seems pretty obvious. But is the corollary to this that a mediocre student should maybe aim higher in their college choice if they know for a fact their parents have the ability to pay full price? Because these same colleges must be maybe looking for people who can pay full price and then use their tuition to entice others, or is that a little too much of a game?
Well, I think it may be more like the obvious that is true, or at least has become, one of many strategies that kind of exist in the arsenal of families who are thinking hard about this and know how the system works. What they're saying to their kids is, this is a giant crapshoot, right? We may not qualify for much, if any, need-based aid, but we are not going to be able, and we are not going to be willing to pay $75,000 at full price. So by all means, take your shot at the schools, the very selective schools that do not offer merit aid, and we'll hope that we get some need-based financial aid from them. But you need to know that if we don't, then we're not going to be able to pay for it. And so maybe you should consider the opposite tack, which is that if you are, an Oberlin or an Occidental or a Tulane quality student by the academic numbers, maybe instead of Oberlin, you should apply to Connecticut College. And maybe instead of Tulane, you should apply to Loyola of New Orleans. And maybe instead of Occidental, you might try, Whitman in Washington, schools where it's a little bit easier to get in and where you might be more likely to get a bigger merit aid package.
And you mentioned a lot of colleges in your book, so I would suggest that people run out and buy your book, because the price alone is a fraction of what you might save if you kind of know which colleges to target. I'm allowed to say that because I loved your book. Your book was such a treat, and I really couldn't put it down. There's a chapter in your book about snobbery and elitism. What is your advice for parents navigating these very real issues?
Sure. So, if I'm good at anything in my newspaper column, it is helping people identify the feelings that get in the way of sound financial decision making. We all have them, and many of us, to greater and lesser extent, sort of fail to identify them or willfully ignore them. So in part 2 of The Price You Pay for College, I try to sort of get in people's faces about the feelings that this process is almost custom designed to evoke, right? There's guilt that you haven't earned enough or saved enough or done enough to position your family and your child in particular for this moment. There is fear that if they don't go to the right place and if you don't spend enough, they're going to go tumbling down the social class ladder that your family may have spent decades or generations trying to clamber up. And then there's snobbery and elitism, right? And some families, very few, but some, manage to embrace or at least confront their inner snob and their inner elitist and have a conversation about just exactly why it is that they are so sure that private is better than public, or the name brand that means something in southwestern Connecticut is so important to them, and whether it should be or not, right? Then other people take a more practical view. They think, okay, I may be a little bit of a snob, but you know who's really a snob? The people who occupy the admissions offices at the top law schools and the top medical schools and at Goldman Sachs and at Y Combinator and venture capital firms and the kinds of places that my kid just might want to approach 4 or 5 years from now for admission, acceptance, and job offer, right? And so they convince themselves that, or maybe it's the child, him or herself, who is like dead set on being an investment banker at a top firm, or getting the plum job at Teach for America, right? Like those jobs are just increasingly difficult to get. And so as a parent, you want to be practical about the fact that a disproportionate number of people who get these fancy jobs and who get into the fancy grad schools, the most competitive ones, do in fact come from institutions that have higher average SAT scores. You can't deny that fact. So is that alone, trying to increase those odds, reason enough to pay up to $200,000 more? That's the question that you have to ask yourself. But I went out and generated a bunch of numbers, looking at percentages of people, in elite graduate schools, and also some of these elite entry-level jobs and other industries that come from more selective institutions. And it's real, but I would ask people to think very hard about whether that is really what their 17-year-old wants for themselves, and whether that alone is worth an extra up to $200,000.
And that's very much what the family might be considering. It seemed like snobbery is always a little bit silly, but the elitism was very pragmatic. It's like, if you know for a fact that you would love for your kid to get hired by McKinsey, Well, you might as well know that they're only going to recruit from a certain number of colleges. Now, this is Greenwich, so you're definitely going to find an audience for people like that here, who would really benefit from knowing those things. And you had actually named or sort of figured out 45 colleges that the numbers were pretty extraordinary, that if you took sort of the top, your version of the top 45, that a very high percentage go on to be recruited by these companies. But no matter what, at the same time, in a lot of cases, at least half don't come from those colleges. So there's always hope, I guess.
There is always hope, right? Yeah. And but again, the thing that you have to ask yourself is that you may imagine for your child a life and a career and a trajectory that looks something like whatever it is that you have managed for yourself, particularly if you've landed at or near the top of your field. But you may have no idea whether that is what your child has in mind for him or herself. And if what they want is to be the best possible teacher or the best possible social worker or the best possible clinical psychologist, you might want to ask yourself, right, is $300,000 for the nameplate private institution or an Ivy League school where a whole bunch of faculty don't really give a hoot about the undergraduates, right? Is that really money well spent? Or might you want to save it for the clinical psychology PhD years so that your child doesn't spend 5 years starving, while they get their credential, right? I mean, these are the sorts of things that you need to ask yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And if a kid has a vision, I would think that a lot of 18-year-olds really don't have a vision. So maybe like the Tiger moms and the Tiger dads, channel their inner Amy Chua and take over and have all sorts of ideas. But it's a really good idea to almost, they say kind of like leave some powder dry financially for where this kid might want to go to graduate school and things like that, if they don't need to end up at a McKinsey or an investment bank or such. Your book is a treasure trove of valuable research. It's really incredibly well researched. And one thing I read that just stopped me in my tracks was that if your child wants to go into a STEM field, my child wants to go into a STEM major, that if they go to a large public university, they only have a 50% chance of graduating in 4 years. But if they go to a private college, it's more like 80%. I mean, that's a stunning statistic. So where can parents find this information just outside your book?
So here's the thing, stuff like that is extremely telling from a consumer perspective doesn't show up in the admissions brochures. So you have to know, right? So, you have to know, unless it's good news, right? So you have to know what to ask and you have to know who to ask. And so, it begins with the admissions office and it probably won't end there because they won't have their hands on that information. And then they may not write you back, when you send them a pointed note asking for the information. So you're well within your right to figure out who the head of the biology department is and write that person an email, because that professor's email is almost always online on their faculty profile page, and say, hey, my kid's thinking about coming to school here. I'd just like to know what percentage of the people who declare the biology major freshman year actually manage to finish in 4 years. And if it's not 4 years, how long does it usually take them? And if it isn't 4 years, that isn't always the wrong answer, right? Presumably the department is going to have some qualitative or demographic information about the kinds of students who begin the major and complete it, right? And maybe your kid is different from the kids who don't finish. And maybe if your kid does take 5 years instead of 4, that's fine with you, because you're still going to be saving a whole bunch more, money over what they would have, over what you would have spent someplace else. But if you do not go into this eyes wide open with an understanding of what the odds are and why they are the way they are, then you're probably doing it wrong and leaving too much to chance.
And if you don't even know about it, if you're in Greenwich and you send your kid to a large public university in another state, you're actually paying a lot of money and you're going to pay for a 5th year. So you don't want that to come as a surprise.
Absolutely
Um,
not. I mean, yeah, you need to know what you're in for. And look, part of what I'm trying to do here in the book is raise an army. I mean, I don't mean to be confrontational about this, but at these prices, we are entitled to way more information than what is currently made available to us. And so I want to literally arm people with dozens and dozens of more pointed questions, not all of which will be applicable to every applicant and every school, but I want people to feel like this is information to which they are entitled, and I want them to feel empowered to go out and ask for it. And the more people that do, the more normalized those questions will be, and the more information will be at the fingertips of the people who really should be putting a whole lot more of it out there.
And entitled is a great word, because I think when parents are paying between $200,000 and $300,000 for an education, they feel entitled to things like a great career center. They would just assume at those prices that there's going to be this wonderful career center that's going to match their kid with a terrific job. And you have some news for them, don't you?
Yeah, most of them suck, to use a technical word, and the university administrators themselves recognize it. I mean, I couldn't believe it when the president of Bates College said to me, "Oh yeah, the more expensive the school, the more prestigious the school, the worse the career center." And she sort of chuckled, but it was true, which is why she decided to blow it up and start over. And it took years. I heard the same thing from the president of St. Olaf College in Minnesota, who sort of described it to me. When he got there, he said it was basically this sort of decrepit building at the edge of campus with a bunch of people who were trained in the 70s and 80s, and nobody ever went there, and for good reason, right? And he made it part of his strategic plan to be the very best small liberal arts college in America at career counseling. So let me tell you, that is a very hard thing to do if you are St. Olaf College and you are far from a major metropolitan area. Because if you do not have ready access to internships and to recruiters who can, sort of step right off of an airplane and onto campus, or who can come from a major, employer that has a huge office, within a short car ride away, it's a really difficult thing to accomplish. It's a hard thing to do. And as much as I love small liberal arts colleges, that are in the middle of nowhere, they are at a disadvantage when it comes to career counseling, and they need to work twice as hard to make their operations excellent. And you should feel, here's the word again, entitled to ask extremely pointed questions about how they get over their geographical disadvantage or their size disadvantage, or the fact that maybe they don't traditionally send a lot of people to medical school or to teaching careers or to whatever it is that your teenager may have expressed an interest in.
Well, it just sounds very practical to think about these things. And when you're paying, upwards of $200,000, it shouldn't come as a surprise that those services don't exist. I wanted to turn now to some questions from Greenwich High School. The counselors at Greenwich High School were thrilled you were virtually coming to town, and they wanted to, they had a lot of questions, and we said, well, this is supposed to be a 40-minute talk. So they boiled it down to 2, but it really gets back to these sort of the practical side, especially for families, that are struggling. They want to make sure that there's, a career at the end of the tunnel, sort of thing. So their first question, this is from the guidance counselors at Greenwich High School, is how can high schools encourage students and their families to consider options such as careers that require apprenticeships and licensure as a viable alternative to a bachelor's degree immediately after high school?
So I guess the best way to do that, right? I'm not a huge fan of encouraging teenagers to have strong vocational instincts before they even get out of high school, let alone commit to one or the other. So that's the sort of developmental challenge with, encouraging a trade or trade school or an apprenticeship. But another way to think about it is kind of as a form of sampling, right? Now, we would all be so much better off if colleges did not accept anyone at all until they had spent a year or two out in the world doing something different, whether it's joining the armed forces or doing a form of non-military national service or serving some kind of apprenticeship, maybe up to and including or a mandatory apprenticeship that involves working with your hands or in a trade that does not require a college degree. Because then if people were sort of forced to sample things, they might find things that they really love and that they would love more than whatever white collar gig they might end up in after going to college. And we are probably going to have a shortage of skilled tradespeople going forward. So it's a worthy goal for the country. And I think it's a worthy goal for the happiness of adults who might find something that they truly love. So I think if we can find a way, and this is of course a difficult thing to ask of educators who are already being pulled in 100,000 different directions, right? But I'm starting to see in more affluent communities this sort of like defining of internships downward. Whereas, less than a generation ago, you were in a good shape if you had an internship or two under your belt coming out of college. Now, but all sorts of high school students feel like they need to have a couple of internships under their belt just in order to be a good college applicant, which I don't think is necessarily true, but it's happening anyway, right? If we could take these internships and make them apprenticeships that allow high school students to truly sample a career that they might not otherwise consider or that their parents would never have considered, then maybe we're doing something useful.
It sounds like, and I agree with you that like just a straight vocational route at such a young age, you're not a fan of. But you do talk a lot about gap years, and this seems to sort of fit more into your chapter about gap years and how you can get sort of experience and mature in a gap year in a way that when you finally go to college, you're not going to waste your money. Is that right?
I think that's right. And it's been borne out with data. There's enough data out there that shows that people who come a year or two after the traditional age end up getting better grades than people who don't. And it's no surprise, their brains have matured a year. And I think more importantly, they've gone out into the world and maybe ruled some things out, right? They've sampled some things or seen some things in the world that make them more sure about the things that they are not interested in, and potentially, hopefully, more passionate about the things that they had a hunch that they might be interested in. So it's no surprise that they come back into the classroom with a bigger head of steam on average and more skills to succeed than the kids who just show up right after high school. And so, the gap year doesn't necessarily always have to be about sampling, vocationally, but almost automatically, when you're away from the classroom for a year, you just get more access to the range of possibilities that exist in the world for a human adult, and that cannot be bad.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. Second question from Greenwich High School: given the financial constraints on access to higher education, do you think more corporations will consider hiring people without a bachelor's or graduate degree and provide training and professional development directly related to their industry?
I think it's possible, and some of it is already happening. You see it most often in software, not so much in technology industries in particular, although it does happen there. Google has done some of this already. I think IBM has messed around with some of it as well. But just software developers, right? There are ways to get certificates and to prove through testing that you have a particular set of skills and ability that a college degree wouldn't necessarily provide for you. And so there's some of that going on already. But here's the thing that you have to remember, and this has more to do with human nature than it does with provable skills. The vast majority of people who work for major corporations and large employers themselves have college degrees, particularly ones that are in a position to hire and make strategic decisions. And so how many of them are willingly going to devalue their own experience and make that kind of radical change in the way that they hire large numbers of people? That is going to require a pretty big mental leap. And I think a lot of data in any and every role for which they choose to do that or even experiment with it, that it will actually work, right? And so that to me is a process where if it comes into existence on any kind of large scale, is going to take decades and not years.
So probably not a great way to save money right now. I mean, if you really want your kid to succeed, you're pretty much going to need the bachelor's degree.
I wouldn't bank on them being able to do it without it. It is not a good economic bet, but it does work out for some people. And so you just have to understand that, if your child insists on not going, or if you have made a determination that it's just not money well spent, that you are taking a big risk with your child's economic future. Now, that child may grow up to be an artist or a salesperson or an entrepreneur in a way that does not ever require a college degree, and maybe they will earn less money than the average degree holder, and maybe that's just fine with them, and there's nothing wrong with that. But you just need to know exactly what sort of odds you're facing in terms of the finances, which is what I try to lay out in the book.
Yeah, and stick with the odds. You suggest that parents talk to their kids about the cost of college as early as 8th grade. What should parents tell their middle schoolers?
Well, I think you need to start by having a sort of frank conversation with your spouse, if you have one, or your ex, if you have one, about exactly what kind of kid you think you're dealing with here, right? And see if the two of you, again, if there are two, are on the same page in terms of, how kind of motivated, self-motivated they are. Because here's the thing that's different from when we went to college. Your high school grades are now potentially worth $100,000 or more in discounts off the rack rate of so many institutions in the United States. So if you do not tell your child that that is how the system works, and then they don't wake up to it until their junior year when they're starting to think about college, and they realize that they could have done better with a little bit of a bigger fire lit under their butt, at that point, will they turn on you or turn on your school and say, why didn't you tell me that this is how things work? How could you have kept this from me? I can't believe I didn't know this, because now all my choices are constrained, right? That's not a situation you want to end up in. So I feel like for the child who might need a little bit extra motivation, you sort of have to tell them how things work before high school starts, lest you be in a situation where you regret not having done so. Now, I get that these kids are already under enormous amounts of pressure, right? And now we're going to heap financial pressure on top of them too. Well, look, in states where this is just the way things are done, it hasn't crushed kids' mental health, right? In a state like Georgia has for decades now had something called the Hope Scholarship, where you get money for college depending on your grades in high school. And kids know this, and it's just a part of life, and it's been normalized. Or if you think about the kids who are on a trajectory to maybe get a athletic scholarship, or they're shooting for one, you can bet that the kids on the 7th and 8th grade travel teams know what teams they need to make and what stats or numbers they need to put up to have a shot at a Division I scholarship, which is itself a discount that could potentially be worth $100,000 or more. So kids know this. They've been handling it for decades. I don't think we're going to ruin them by telling them how the system works.
That's really interesting. I actually thought you were saying talk to your 8th grader to let them share the burden of how expensive college is. You're sort of taking it to a different level of help them understand they'll have much better options if they just work a little bit more on their grades and test scores. It sounds like test scores are here to stay, even though we're sort of hearing in the news that they're, this particular season, they're not that important. But for merit aid, it seems like test scores are important.
Well, we're in an era that has defied all predictions, so I would not dare to say whether test scores are still going to be an important component of merit aid decision making in a couple of years. This year, it's not a component, but it really, who knows what's going to happen going forward. But I'm glad you made the point that you did, which is because there's a larger conversation, you know, a more macro one that you need to have with your kid. If you are in a situation where you are not going to be able to pay out of pocket for every college in existence, where you're not going to be willing to borrow to get to those rack rates, or whether you're someplace fuzzy on the kind of ability or willingness continuum because your financial life is in upheaval because of the pandemic, or you just can't predict what other big expenses might come the family's way. And so whatever it is, I do feel like you as a parent or parents owe your kids an explanation if there is going to be some sort of constraint that they might attempt to work against by virtue of their academic performance in particular.
That's great. That's great. Your book is great. I'm just so happy you're here, and I'm sure I speak for the entire town that this is wonderful. You end your book on a very positive note. You talk about hope. Why should parents feel hopeful?
Well, the thing that is different about college from making, say, a high school or a grade school or a preschool choice for your child is that there are just so many options. And the thing that I had forgotten about the way college feels until I went out and visited, you know, dozens of them and, you know, grilled their presidents and vice presidents of enrollment management is what it feels like walking around those places. There's this sense of optimism that pervades the air where anything is possible, right? And there are all of these resources and all of these grownups there who at their best think nothing except how to turn raw 18-year-olds into more refined 22-year-olds who have all the tools they need to go out into the world and be happy. And you know, I was overcome with this feeling of jealousy, right? That my daughters were going to get to do this, and it was already in my rearview mirror, and I wasn't going to get to do it again. And that made me feel hopeful. And there were all sorts of places that I'd never been to, including one that I focus in the book called College of Worcester, which many parents on the East Coast and West Coast have never heard of, right? Which just does, you know, fantastic things for the right kinds of schools, for the right kinds of kids. So there are dozens and dozens and dozens of schools out there that are not going to cost $75,000 a year that can and do extraordinary things for the right kind of student. And families just need to ask better questions to find their ways to the ones that are not just the best fit in terms of being able to get in, but also the best fit in terms of the value that they deliver.
That's great. I work a lot with young people, and it's just such a joy to be around them because they haven't learned yet all the things that can go wrong.
Right.
So their energy and they're just like fun. Even in the pandemic, I found, you know, that young people, the kids I work with who are just zooming into class and they're not on campus, they're still really happy, which is fantastic. So thank you for that bit of hope, and thank you so much for your time. This has been fantastic.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much for your interest.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, Ron. Hope today's program will help our audience navigate this difficult and often confusing journey. Greenwich Library has The Price You Pay for College, an entirely new roadmap for the biggest financial decision your family will ever make in both print and downloadable formats. If you need a signed copy by author, please see the purchase link in the events listing on the library's website or contact Diane's bookstore directly. Thank you all.